Okay, this week we'd like to introduce to you the concept of policy windows. We'll discuss this concept using two different models or frameworks, and the goal is that whatever your area of policy interest is, you'll be able to use one of these to focus in on what kind of policy intervention might be feasible at this point in time. Okay, so here are the two frameworks that we'll talk about in this video. The first one is the Multiple Streams Framework, MSF, and this is described by John Kingdon. And the second one is called the Overton Window, and this was described by Joe Overton. Okay, so first, the Multiple Streams Framework by Kingdon. So Kingdon is a political science professor emeritus at the University of Michigan, and he has written a lot about the structure of American political institutions and how they're shaped and how they determine what kinds of policy issues get taken up and which policy solutions succeed in getting passed and which do not. One really good book of his, which I believe we recommend or assign at some point in this course, is Agendas, Alternatives, and Public Policies. This is originally from 1995, but there have been some updated editions. And this book is about policy dynamics in general, not just in healthcare, but he does use a lot of healthcare examples throughout the book. So it's good for our purposes, probably of interest to you. The main idea of this model is that for an issue to get onto a government's agenda, three things must come into confluence. First, there must be a problem. So maybe something isn't working as it should, or something is working, but it's perceived as being too costly, or perhaps there has been an aggregation of accidents or a series of disasters of some sort or another. Or maybe there's been a failure to meet some previously publicized goal. Any one of those things could be a problem. And Kingdon makes a point of saying that budgets are a special type of problem in the sense that governments always have to deal with budgets. So if the issue that you're interested in working on has some sort of cost associated with it, or an effect on a budget, then that's probably a good thing for your case because cost considerations always present a challenge. Next, there must be a solution, some sort of solution available. The solution, of course, is the proposal that is offered to solve the problem. Now, Kingdon would say that there's almost never just one solution available for any given problem. The policy community, as he describes it, is made up of lots and lots of people working in a variety of organizations and groups and committees and everything. So you have people coming up with solutions who work in government, such as in the Congressional Budget Office or one of the many agencies. You have senators and representatives and all of their staff members. There are also all sorts of other kinds of advocates too. And those might even include academics. They can include consultants, policy analysts for think tanks, lobbyists who work for industries and special interests. Often they will all have their own solution at the ready, just waiting to promote it and advocate for it. And so the bottom line here is that there does need to be some solution that someone can grab a hold of and run with. If there's no solution, then even if there's a problem, government actors they'll move on to the next issue because they don't have unlimited time and resources to create the solution out of nothing or on the spot. And finally, there needs to be some political will to make some change. This in part refers to the set of factors that you might think of as things like the public mood. Kingdon includes things like recent election results, public awareness campaigns, party balance in various branches and houses of government, and so on. Elected officials judge their constituents' mood from all sorts of things, including mail and email and phone calls and town halls and television and the media and so on. And when there's one national mood, certain policy proposals will appear to be doable. But then when the mood shifts, that may no longer be the case, and now a different set of proposals are compatible with that new mood. You probably notice how the mood can change for things in health policy. It's also recently taken some big swings in other issues. Gun control, there's been some shift in mood. Or take, for example, drug legalization over the last decade or two, specifically that of marijuana. And so anyway, within government too, there are shifts in moods. Remember that as administrations change, there's key personnel that is turning over. And when an incumbent leaves office, too, political will can change virtually overnight, because among other things, there could be new people at the helm, there could be the rise of a new committee chair, and so on. So problem, solution, and political will are the three core components in Kingdon's model, but there are a couple more pieces that are critical to understanding this model, and here's a graphical representation to help. Those three factors, they sort of feed in from the left, and if they all come together in just the right way and at the same time, then you have a policy window. And a policy window is an opportunity in which a solution can be enacted to attempt to solve a problem. So a policy window is an opportunity in which a solution can be enacted to attempt to solve a problem. Kingdon uses the analogy of a launch window for a space shuttle or a rocket, and that's right on. Everything is in alignment to make everything to make action possible. But just like with a launch window for a space shuttle or something, it won't be that way for long, and it might be a while before everything comes together again. What happens during this policy window is that the advocates, who he calls policy entrepreneurs in his book, they push the solution forward and they manage to get it onto the government agenda, where of course it's usually subject to some sort of vote and review and debate and all of that, depending on what level of government you're talking about. As Kingdon puts it, policy entrepreneurs are, quote, advocates who are willing to invest their resources, time, energy, reputation, and money to promote a position in return for an anticipated future gain in the form of material, purposive, or solidary benefits, end quote. So these policy entrepreneurs perform the function of bringing those three streams together so that proposals can get onto the agenda. So very briefly, why do policy windows close? You might be wondering that. Well, why don't they just don't stay open forever, or at least for a long time, like an entire presidential term, instead of just, say, a few months? And there are three main reasons. First, lots of legislation comes and goes, and so after a while, leaders might figure that they have already addressed the problem. Maybe they've passed some other omnibus legislation that sort of touched on something related to this problem, but it didn't really do it, but they feel like they have addressed it in some way, which could be incorrect. Number two, if the proposed solution fails to get action, leaders will be, quote, unwilling to invest further time, energy, political capital, or other resources in the endeavor, end quote. That's a quote from Kingdon. And similarly, number three, the events that prompted the window to open may pass from the scene, and so the urgency for that particular issue dissipates, and the energy for doing that dissipates. One last quote from Kingdon before we move on, kind of like this one. This is from the conclusion of chapter 8, which is the chapter on policy windows in that book that I showed you. Quote, policy entrepreneurs who advocate their pet alternative are responsible for this coupling of the three streams. They keep their proposal at the ready, waiting for one of two things: a problem that might float by to which they can attach their solution, or a development in the political stream, such as a change of administration that provides a receptive climate of their proposal. Some windows open largely on a schedule, others are quite unpredictable. But a window closes quickly. Opportunities come, but they also pass, and if a chance is missed, another must be awaited, end quote. So I think that was a good little summary of the Kingdon model, the MSF. Okay, now on to the other model that we want to talk about. This one is called the Overton Window, and both Kingdon's MSF model and the Overton Window are very broadly used and referred to. I'd say it's slightly more common to see Kingdon in academic circles and slightly more common to see Overton in use at think tanks and independent policy institutes, but both are broadly used, and I think both are definitely worth knowing. Kind of orientational things to know about the Overton window. It was developed at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy in the 1990s. The Mackinac Center is a policy think tank based in Michigan, and this particular model is named after its creator, Joe Overton, who actually sadly died rather young in a plane crash in 2003. But moving on, I think the Mackinac Center does a good job of summarizing this framework in these few concise sentences. So I'll sort of let these speak for themselves. I'll quote it here, but quote, "The core concept is that politicians are limited in what policy ideas they can support. They generally only pursue policies that are widely accepted throughout society as legitimate policy options. These policies lie inside the Overton window. Other policy ideas exist," we're talking about solutions here, but politicians risk losing popular support if they champion these ideas. These policies lie outside the Overton window. So let's see this in action. So for almost any given issue, there's generally a range of different policy options. Sometimes there are just a few, but often there are many. And what you do is put them, if you want to kind of create this this model here, what you do is you put the most radical policy ideas on the ends of the stack here, either the top or the bottom, and then fill in the sort of less radical policy options toward the middle until you have a sort of reasonably good continuum of policy options, and the more centrist options are in the middle. And then like I said, the more kind of outside the mainstream options are to either side. And this may or may not coincide with the sort of left-right political spectrum, but I think in order to have some distance from that, because it doesn't necessarily coincide with it, the Mackinac Center put it as like a stack, up and down instead of a left and right kind of thing. The example here from the Mackinac Center happens to be on education policy. And in their view, at one end of the spectrum, the top, that might be a policy of, let's say, no government policy on school attendance. But then at the other end of the spectrum, at the bottom, that might be all students must attend federally controlled schools. And those are both strong statements, strong policy options, right? But there's a lot of room in the middle for other kind of mixes and matches of policy solutions. All the policies in the middle are various steps that either are closer to one end of or the other of those two ends. Now, some of the policy options are eligible to be talked about. So if you are a policymaker, a policy analyst, an advocate, you can bring them up in a legislative session, in a committee, and so on. And you won't get not laughed at, but you're not going to get a reaction like, oh, you're out of touch, you're unrealistic, etc. If the timing is right, the people are receptive to it, and so forth. Then those are the options that you can draw a window around. Those are the options that are within the window, and the other ideas are outside the window. So now, if the policy proposal that you really want to get passed is inside the window, then that's good news for you. You have a shot at making it work. But if it's outside the window, then you have to think about whether you want to try to move the window, because that window can slide up and down in whichever direction, if you want to go up or down on that scale. Or sometimes the window is very narrow, and it only includes only two different things are being talked about right now as options, and you want to widen it. You think, well, you don't necessarily need to like shift the whole window, but we do need to bring in some other policy options to widen this. So the window does not have a fixed location or a fixed size. Moving on here. So here I have moved us away from the educational policy example that the Mackinac Center has on their website, and I kind of created a public health example. Now there's a very contentious debate going on right now about electronic cigarettes. I'm not trying to take a stand here exactly. I'm just trying to come up with an example that you can relate to. But and so here's how you might set up an Overton window model to help you think about this particular issue. So on one side, we could have something along the lines of no regulation at all. On the other end of the spectrum, we might have some sort of total ban on e-cigarettes, right? And then you have all the intermediary policy arrangements between those two. Right now, a political figure can, pretty easily endorse any of the views within the window, without too much, electoral risk or other types of risks. But to endorse a view outside the window is at least a little bit more risky, right? And actually, even since I've kind of been thinking about this, I've noticed that there are some states that have moratoriums, so on vaping stores, and so even as we're doing this is shifting and expanding. Now, one thing before we move on to think about is, what is your strategy going to be if the policy that you'd really like to see is far outside the window? So let's say you are a public health professional who is engaged in some sort of policy advocacy. If your view is outside the window, then you might either want to think about creating a pathway from one of the ideas that's already there that runs through one of the more sort of acceptable positions in current discourse on its way to your position. And so that's how some people might approach it. That would be a kind of incrementalist approach. It takes some time, and you have to be okay with not letting your preferred or not getting your preferred policy right away. But it might just be the right slow and steady approach for your particular issue. On the other hand, you might view that as too much of an unacceptable compromise, and you really want to insist on advocating for that ideal proposal, even if it's seen as radical in some way. And so maybe what you'd be hoping for there is that by continuing to push your idea in the general public first, you create some sort of awareness and education about your vision, and then you slowly widen that window until you can become part of the conversation. But if that's the case, if that's the approach that you take, then you have to at least be okay with being the only voice for a while, because it's very rare that a politician endorses a view that's outside of the window, and these things do take time. So it's partially about having the right expectation and knowing and having an appreciation for how these things actually work. Okay, so again, to end on a sort of a nice summary quotation from the source directly, quote, "The Overton window doesn't describe everything about how politics works, but it does describe one key thing. Politicians will not support whatever policy they choose whenever they choose. Rather, they will only espouse policies that they believe do not hurt their electoral chances. And the range of policy options available to a politician are shaped by ideas, social movements, shared norms and values within society. And all of this suggests that politicians are more followers than they are leaders, and it's the rest of us who ultimately determine the types of policies they'll get behind." Okay, so that's the basic idea of a policy window, seen in two different ways. To recap, Kingdon sees policy windows as coming from those three separate streams that align at a certain place in time, whereupon a policy entrepreneur appears on the scene and pushes it forward onto the agenda. And Overton sees policy windows as more of it's the subset of ideas along a broader continuum of ideas that are acceptable to endorse. And an interesting dynamic there being that you can try to shift or change the size of that window until it includes your preferred policy. So anyway, I hope that was helpful. And if you have any questions, just let us know. We can talk about these things in class. Thank you.